You might have seen a video or read an article about the Great Wealth Transfer, where trillions of dollars of generational wealth is about to be handed down to younger generations. And while that is an important topic, it's not the only wealth transfer that's been happening. And if you ask Ray Dalio, who in my view is the greatest macroeconomist of all time, there's a much more important wealth transfer going on behind the scenes, one that far less people seem to understand. Rather than a shift in money from baby boomers to millennials, this is a transfer of wealth from public institutions to private ones, a transfer so severe that it's likely to have ripple effects across American households for decades. So let me take you down the river of understanding the great wealth transfer that Ray Dalio believes will define the next century, the great wealth transfer that nobody is talking about. We're not going to be discussing the generational wealth transfer in this video, but it is a really important topic to understand, so if you want to read up on it, I'll link the Daily Upsides article about this down in the description below. They're a completely free business and investing newsletter with over 1 million people signed up, including myself. It's really easy to sign up, and each weekday you'll be delivered a morning brief on the important news stories that are shaping the business world, followed by more detailed articles. An important part of what I do here on YouTube is finding reliable sources of information that's unbiased and cuts through the noise. And when I came across the Daily Upside earlier in the year, it was so valuable to me that it quickly became a regular part of my daily research. Regardless of whether you're someone who actually works in the finance sector or you're someone who just wants to stay up to date with the top business stories, I guarantee you'll get a ton of value out of subscribing. Again, it's totally free to sign up and you'll receive one information-filled email every morning, so join the 1 million people, including managing directors and principals of some of Wall Street's largest institutions who trust the Daily Upside. Sign up via the link in the description. Some of you who clicked on this video would have done so to hear Ray Dalio's perspective on the issue specifically, while others probably aren't sure why he's someone we should listen to. I could point to his success at starting and building Bridgewater Associates, an investment fund that manages more than $100 billion of clients' money, or his prediction of the 2008 financial crisis, of which Barron said nobody was better prepared for. But while these events certainly contribute to my confidence in Dalio, more than anything else, it's his relentless desire to help everyday people understand the mechanics of how the economy works. Whether it's the pandemic impact on the economy or the internet bubble of the late 90s, every significant economic event is different, but the cause and effect always follow similar patterns that we've observed for hundreds of years. So if you can understand the fundamentals of what Ray Dalio calls the economic machine, then you too can understand these important events as they unfold. Dalio's recent memo is about a large wealth transfer that's happening right now, where trillions of dollars are being moved from the government's pocket into the pocket of private businesses and households. You might be thinking, yes, Hamish, we know the government gave out stimulus checks during the pandemic, transferring money from the government to households. And yes, that is part of what we're talking about here, but it's not the main part of the transfer that's important to understand. To fully grasp the gravity of what's happening, I need to go back to the beginning. The US government operates like most major countries when it comes to money. There's a system for collecting tax on income, luxury goods, on behaviors the government wants to deter, and a bunch of other things. For you, tax is kind of like an expense, but for the government, it's revenue. It's money they can use to redistribute wealth to areas that need it the most, such as taxing higher income earners at a higher rate than lower income earners, and using that money to provide social security for retirees. So money flows from the private sector, which are households and businesses, to the public sector, which is the government, and then it flows back to the private sector, redistributed based on the government's spending decisions at Congress. But the government isn't just limited to spending the exact amount of tax revenue that they receive. They can spend less than they collect in revenue, which is called a budget surplus, or they can spend more than they collect in revenue, which is called a budget deficit. And the government can't just create money out of thin air. They are bound by the same rules of money as everybody else. So if they're spending more money than they receive in tax revenue, they have to borrow money to make up the difference. The government writes an IOU, called a treasury bond. It's It's a piece of paper that says they'll pay you back $1,000 plus some interest along the way called coupons. The government writes a whole heap of these and sells them all around the world. And everybody loves US Treasury bonds because they offer a return that's often acceptable and it's extremely safe. They've never in their history failed to pay anyone's IOU back. As of last month, the US had total national debt of $32.5 trillion. Most of the debt is held by the public, such as banks, businesses, or even you or me. We can go out and buy treasury bonds if we want to. This part of the pie also includes money borrowed from other countries, such as Japan, China, and the UK. But there's a large part of the pie which is labeled intragovernmental holdings. About $6.9 trillion of government debt is owned by the government. Hang on a second, how can the government borrow money from itself? How can the government own its own debt? Well, it's complicated and there's a lot of layers to this that I won't explain in this video because your head might explode. But a large component of US government debt is held by a government institution called the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve is a government institution. It is technically a part of the government, but it generally acts independent from the government. So it's kind of easier just to think of it as not a part of the government. The Federal Reserve is in charge of stabilizing the economy. And one of the ways they do this is by purchasing US Treasury bonds. So how does the Federal Reserve purchasing US Treasury bonds help the economy? Well, just like any other market, supply and demand dictates how much a treasury bond costs. Or in other words, changes in supply and demand for lending money to the US government changes how much it costs the US government to borrow money. If there's heaps of demand for lending money to the US government, then it'll be cheaper for the government to borrow money. So if the Federal Reserve can add to the demand side by buying a bunch of bonds, it actually reduces pressure on the government. Most of the time, this relationship between the government and the Federal Reserve is fairly independent, but in special circumstances, they actually team up. And I know, I literally just said that the Federal Reserve acts independently from the government, and most of the time they do. But there are very, very rare circumstances where it's actually necessary for the two institutions to actually work together. Sometimes all of a sudden, the government needs to spend an enormous amount of money very, very quickly. And when this happens, the government needs to borrow an enormous amount of money very, very quickly. And it's not as simple as just snapping their fingers and borrowing more money. Remember, the government borrows money by writing IOUs called treasury bonds and selling them all around the world. So if they suddenly need to sell a lot more of these bonds, there has to be someone on the other side willing to buy those additional bonds. There has to be someone willing to make up the demand gap that's created by a sudden increase in supply of bonds. So this is where sometimes they team up with the Federal Reserve, because the Federal Reserve can actually print money. So they can just create a bunch of money out of thin air and use it to buy those government bonds, meeting the sudden increase in supply of government bonds. The first time that this happened in our lifetime on a big scale was during the pandemic. A sudden shutdown in the economy required government spending to increase from about $4.8 trillion in 2019 to $8.9 trillion by the second quarter of 2022. The budget deficit exploded from $350 billion to almost $2 trillion, so the government needed a ton of money really quickly. They issued a huge amount of treasury bonds and the Federal Reserve bought them. This is the Federal Reserve's assets during that time. Their assets went from under $4 trillion to over $7 trillion in 2020. Okay, so let's slow down for a second because I know I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you. So if the government spends more money than they receive in revenue, they have to make up the difference by borrowing money. And in special circumstances, if they need to spend a lot of money and they therefore need to borrow a lot of money, they'll team up with the Federal Reserve, who prints a bunch of money and buys that debt, essentially lending money to the government. So if you really step back and take a look at what happened during the pandemic, essentially the Federal Reserve, which typically acts independently from the government, essentially they just printed a bunch of money and gave it to the government to do whatever they wanted with. But how is that a wealth transfer to the private sector? Well, this is where Ray Dalio's article really helps, because he shares a number of really important charts and graphs that demonstrate the consequences of what just happened. He writes, there was a big government-engineered shift in wealth from the public sector, the central government and central bank, and holders of government bonds, to the private sector, i.e. households and businesses. As a result of this coordinated government maneuver, the household sector's balance sheets and income statements are in good shape, while the government's are in bad shape. All that money borrowed from the government in 2020 and 2021 went straight to households and businesses. Some of it was literally a check, and some of it arrived in other ways, such as increased infrastructure spending. And as a consequence of that, households have generally been in pretty good financial shape recently. During 2020, personal income surged at the same time as personal spending collapsed, and that led to huge household savings rates reaching almost 35%. But it's also left the government in really bad shape. The budget deficit has improved since 2020, but it's still pretty bad relative to the last 50 years. And total government debt has been accelerating. In the same way that if you use a credit card to go and buy a phone, you're essentially taking money out of your pocket and putting it in Apple's pocket. The US government has been excessively using its credit card to put money in the private sector's pocket. And this unique situation where the government and the Federal Reserve have worked together to provide trillions of dollars of stimulus in the space of a couple of years is the explanation for why the economy hasn't reacted badly to the recent rate hikes. Households and businesses just have more assets than any time in the past, and that's helping to reduce the negative impact of inflation and interest rate increases. So what happens next for the government? How have they historically dealt with this poor financial situation? Well, there's basically 4 different ways that the government can deal with its high debt burden, and I'm going to go through and explain each of them and then show you what Ray Dalio thinks is the most likely to take place. The first way is to borrow more money. This might sound silly, and it kind of is, but an entity like the US government can get away with doing this for a very long time. The government has basically been in budget deficit for most of the past 20 years, meaning not only have they made no attempt to pay down the debts, they've also been accruing more and more debt at an accelerating rate over the past 20 years. And this can go on for a very long time, but it's not really a solution, because eventually the debt burden gets so high that they can't keep borrowing more money. The second solution is to raise taxes, and therefore increase revenue and reach a budget surplus. Once in a budget surplus, they can potentially start to pay down some of the debts that have been accrued. The third solution works the same way. They could cut annual spending on things like healthcare and defense to reach a surplus. And lastly, the Federal Reserve could keep printing money and buying bonds, essentially continuing to hand money to the government. That last one kind of works hand in hand with the first one, because if the US government just continues to take on more and more debt, there obviously needs to be a buyer on the other side at an accelerating rate, so the Fed may step in, print some money, and be that buyer to support the demand side of the bond market. And none of these options are really favorable at all. The government just kicking the debt can further down the road is going to end in a disaster. Raising taxes or cutting spending on important programs are neither very favorable by the public. And if the Fed does step in and continues to print money and buy bonds, that's going to contribute to persistent inflation. Dalio doesn't think the government will choose one of these solutions and run with it. He thinks they'll likely do a combination of all 4. Higher taxes and cuts to government spending to reduce the deficit, but that the government will probably continue to run a deficit and need to borrow more money. All of these decisions are incredibly unpopular, and there is a national election coming up fast, so there's even more temptation for the government to use its seemingly endless basket of resources to buy themselves a higher chance of re-election. Fortunately, there is a pretty substantial amount of pressure from the public at the moment for the government to focus on reducing inflation. So government spending has improved a lot in the last year. But Dalio says we shouldn't be surprised if economic growth is weak in the near term and if inflation is high, something called stagflation. But it doesn't really matter, because Dalio's memos aren't about predicting what's going to happen. It's about helping you understand the mechanics of what's at play here. Why are things the way they are? If you made it this far in the video, I'd really appreciate it if you could hit that subscribe button. It's free and it tells YouTube that you enjoyed the content and helps it get pushed out to more people. And also, don't forget, if you want to sign up to the Daily Upside, it's a free newsletter, and I guarantee you'll get a ton of value out of their morning briefs. So go check it out, all linked down in the description below.